instructions. I have to confess that I usually do. I open the box, look at the picture, and think, I can put this together. Sometimes it works good, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have extra parts left over, or something's on upside down, but that's just the way it is. That's the way I do things. Well, our passage today gives us specific instructions on how to have a good marriage relationship. These instructions are given by God, our Creator. He's the manufacturer of us. So he's telling us specifically how to act. Back in January, Pastor Mike asked the preaching team to read through 1 Peter and choose a text that we would like to preach on. So after reading the book several times, I decided that 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7 was a passage that I was not going to touch with a 10-foot pole. Wives, submit to your husbands. Causes the hairs on the back of some ladies' necks to go up, and so I decided I'm not going to stir up that hornet's nest. But after reading the book a few more times, I kept being drawn to it. And I think that God was leading me to take it on. And I'm glad I did, because I found out that I still had a lot to learn, even after 44 years of marriage. And I still do have a lot to learn. So I'm going to read you the passage was in your bulletin in the NIV, and I'm going to read it in a different translation, just because there's a few different shades of meaning here that I'd like you to hear. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won over without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observed your chaste and respectful behavior. And let not your adornment be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be in the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. You husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Today, I'd like to explore some of God's instructions for a healthy marriage and see how it not only affects our well-being, but also is a testimony to the world of Jesus' sacrificial love. So I'm coming from the premise that in the creation order, the husband is the head of the household, because God created man first, and he said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper, suitable for him. There are many other scriptures and reasons for this view. It's not my purpose today to argue one view or another view, and I realize that some of you may not hold that premise. But I would like to just explore how in marriage relationships, wives and husbands should love, honor, respect, and understand one another to show each other and the world Jesus' love, sacrifice for us, and guardianship of us, that our prayers may not be hindered. My main sources are a Puritan commentator, John Brown, a Bible study by a contemporary pastor, Juan Sanchez, and another very in-depth study by another contemporary pastor-teacher, John Piper, called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I'd like to read a quote from John Piper's book to demonstrate his views and to give us a setting for this passage. He says, "When I was a boy growing up in Greenville, South Carolina, my father was away from the home about 2/3 of every year. And while he preached across the country, we prayed, my mother, my older sister, and I. And what I learned in those days is that my mother was omnicompetent. She handled the finances, paying all the bills, dealing with the bank and creditors. She once ran a little laundry business on the side. She was active on the park board, served as superintendent of the intermediate department of our Southern Baptist Church, and managed some real estate holdings. She taught me how to cut grass, splice electric cords, pull up Bermuda grass by the roots, paint the eaves, shine the dining room table with a chamois, drive a car, keep the French fries from getting soggy in the cooking oil, and she helped me with maps and geography and showed me how to do a bibliography and work up my science project on static electricity, and also believe that Algebra 2 was actually possible. She dealt with the contractors when we added a basement, and more than once put her hand to the shovel. It never occurred that there was anything she could not do. I heard once that women don't sweat, they glow. My mother sweated. It would drip off the end of her long, sharp nose. Sometimes she would blow it off when she was pushing a wheelbarrow full of peat moss. Or she would wipe it off with her sleeve between strokes of a swing blade. Mother was strong. I can remember her arms even today, 30 years later. They were big. And in the summertime, they were bronze. But it never occurred to me to think of my mother and my father in the same category. Both were strong. Both were bright. Both were kind. Both would kiss me, and both would spank me. Both were good with words. Both prayed with fervor and loved the Bible. But unmistakably, my father was a man and my mother was a woman. They knew it, and I knew it. And it was not mainly a biological fact, it was mainly a matter of personhood and relational dynamics. When my father came home, he was clearly the head of the house. He led in prayer at the table. He called the family together for devotions. He got us to Sunday school and worship. He drove the car. He guided the family where to sit. He made the decision to go to Howard Johnson's for lunch. He led us to our table. He called the waitress. He paid the check. He was the one we knew we would reckon with if we broke one of the family rules or were disrespectful to Mother. These were the happiest times for my mother. Oh, how she rejoiced to have Daddy home. She loved his leadership. Later, I learned that the Bible calls this submission. End of story. Now, every family doesn't have to function exactly like John Piper's. There can be many variations of how your family functions. Back to the creation, God says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Submission doesn't imply superiority or inferiority of either partner. But when the two become one flesh, I believe submission is required just to maintain order in the family. So first, Peter begins with wives, and this exhortation for wives to submit. Be submissive to your own husbands. And Peter has already talked about honoring all men, submitting to government authority, slaves to masters, and following Jesus' example in whatever situation you find yourself, so that we can honor him and show his love to the world. So that's why he, I think, begins this passage with "in the same way." It's like connecting it with all those previous things that we've learned about. I'm not speaking about abusive relationships. Many women have been abused physically and emotionally. So I'm not saying that that's okay. And if you are in such a relationship, you should get help. Why? So that if your husband are unbelievers, they may be won over without a word by this beautiful, respectful behavior. This doesn't mean that you should never say a word about your faith, but don't try to turn every sentence into a sermon. Don't be so involved in the church that you neglect your husband. Don't focus only on outer beauty, but on the inward, imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in God's sight. This word, precious, literally means costly or expensive. Juan Sanchez, in his Bible study, did some research finding that Americans are number one in spending on cosmetics and cosmetic surgery, but they are number 23 in general satisfaction with life. I don't think Peter's saying that it is a sin to wear jewelry or wear attractive clothing or fix your hair. He's not saying that outward beauty is wrong, but eventually it fades as the grass withers and the flower fades. The qualities of a gentle, quiet spirit are imperishable. This word in the original language for gentle occurs only 4 times in the New Testament. Twice they were to describe Jesus, and the other occurrence is in Matthew 5. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Jesus came to earth to establish his kingdom. He was gentle. He was a king, but he did not use military force. So we are to follow his example. The word for imperishable or unfading is an adjective which is used throughout the New Testament to describe heavenly realities which do not fade away or decay. So a gentle and quiet spirit has a beauty which will last for eternity and will not fade away like jewelry or clothing. The passage does not teach that wives or women can't express themselves. They can still be extroverted, talkative, creative, humorous, enthusiastic, scholarly, and active in the community and the church. Any of you who know my wife, Liz, know that she is not afraid to say what she thinks, especially to me. And she is not a wallflower who stands by and allows injustice to go on. That's okay, as long as it's done in a gentle, quiet, and Christ-like manner. Peter turns to the example of holy women of old, particularly Sarah. Critics of Peter's example of Sarah point out that all her faults and times when she was not a good example, she was not perfect. None of us are. But she followed Abraham even when she didn't want to leave the comforts of her own life. And God chose her to be the mother of Israel, the mother of the faithful. And if you are a faithful lady, you are her daughter. And you don't have to be afraid of anything that this life can bring. So now he turns to husbands. You husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker vessel. Since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Fellow heirs of the grace of life, men and women are equal in regards to God's grace. Men and women can be very different, as we know, in their approach to life. Somebody named John Gray wrote a book which I haven't read, but it's called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, just to point out the vast differences between the two perspectives. God created us very different, so we would complement each other. I think John Wayne once said, women, they drove my father crazy, they drove my grandfather crazy, and now they're driving me crazy. they have a different perspective. I've been told by someone, I can't remember who, you can never understand a woman, just stop trying. It's impossible. Well, guess what Peter says? Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Literally means husbands, live with your wives according to knowledge. The NIV and the RSV translations say, live with your wives considerately. This is a good thing, it's a good adjective, but it kind of misses the knowledge aspect. The original language really literally says, live with your wives according to knowledge. Seek to understand your wife. Become a student of her. Spend time with her. Ask her a lot of questions. Learn her concerns, her feelings, and her desires. Then he goes on to say, as with a weaker vessel. I think this means no more than men are generally physically stronger than women. And, of course, there are some exceptions. I have a friend whose wife is a black belt in karate, and he doesn't dare to talk back to her. But generally, men are stronger physically, and women are usually a little weaker physically. Husbands should never use physical force to take advantage of their wives. Another aspect is don't take advantage of your headship. Just because you're the head of the household, don't have the attitude that, I don't care what you think, woman, just submit. That's a bad attitude. Why? Because she's a fellow heir of God's grace. Wives and husbands are equal in God's sight. The leadership is a job where men are expected to love and serve their wives as Christ did the church, being willing to die for them. And the final reason that Peter gives is so your prayers may not be hindered. Verse 12, also in 1 Peter 3, is a quote from Psalm 34. It says, "For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer." Men, this is an awesome responsibility, and God is so concerned about you living with your wife in an understanding way that Peter says that failure to do so will interrupt your relationship with God. Even though this passage is addressed to wives and husbands, these qualities are good for all Christians to pursue. Gentleness, humility, and understanding are qualities which are precious in God's sight. So even if you're not married, it is pleasing to God for you to pursue them. When Liz and I were meeting with our pastor previous to our wedding, way back in 1976, he gave us some very good advice. He said, marriage is not a 50-50 relationship. Both partners need to give 100%. That way there's an overlap, so that if one party is slacking a little bit, there's no gap. There's an overlap if everybody's given 100%. We don't draw an invisible line and say, okay, I'm going to give 50%, I'm going to come right to that line, and you have to come to the line. No, everybody needs to give 100% in order to have a successful marriage. Juan Sanchez, in his study, uses a great illustration. I want to share it with you. He compares the marriage relationship to a dance. He says, God designed the male-female relationship to be a beautiful dance where the man leads and the woman follows. When two people dance, they are of one mind. The man anticipates where he will lead the woman, and the woman anticipates where she will be led. Like dancing, though, this is easier said than done. It takes practice. The marriage relationship requires effort, so that wives and husbands follow God's instructions for a successful, happy marriage that honors Him. So let us follow God's instructions. and learn to dance well. It pleases God. It makes our lives better, and it shows the love of Jesus to the world. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for this passage, and I pray that we have learned something from it, and pray that you will help us to better our marriage relationships and our relationships with others through it. In Jesus'